Good evening, Kyle. Definitely looking forward to your series of videos about consciousness as an illusion. And I took a couple of notes on your video and had a few observations to make. Um, you said right at the beginning that consciousness is an illusion, but by saying that, you don't mean um, that it doesn't exist. You just mean that it is not what we suppose it is, um, from our naive, common sense perspective. Um, and so far I can certainly agree with you. I don't think consciousness is what we suppose it is, which most people suppose that it is some type of substance. And for consciousness to be a substance, it means that it can exist on its own, independent of anything else. And this is our inheritance from the Cartesian tradition, and it's a picture of an isolated ego which is aware of the world without being immediately influenced by anything outside of it. That more than probably, I would say that's definitely not an accurate way of describing consciousness. Now, when you think of consciousness in that way, it does seem to be rather self-fulfilling. You will, if you take yourself from the beginning as this separate ego, experience yourself much like that were the case, and experience others like that were the case. But if we examine this scientifically or phenomenologically, where we're not just assuming and allowing common sense to take hold of us, but we're stepping back and questioning what's really going on. When we do that, it appears that this naive assumption of consciousness as a substance doesn't hold true. So I think we're in agreement thus far. Consciousness, whatever it is, we might say is embedded in the surrounding world, the physical world. It's part of the realm of cause and effect, where everything is related to everything else in this ongoing process. So it's not outside of that process. But you say next that we cannot explain or understand consciousness if we include consciousness in our description. So what I hear you saying there is very similar to what Dennett says, of course, that we need essentially a mechanical or third person explanation of consciousness. If we say that consciousness is the experience of neurons, well, that doesn't work because we've just used this word experience, which is almost synonymous with consciousness, and so we're not getting anywhere. But the thing is, the way I look at this problem is that we have these two distinct angles to take when describing phenomena. We can take the third person, or we could take the first person. But these distinct angles are not worth anything independent of one another. In other words, it's not as though one is more fundamental than the other, or as though one gives us a more accurate picture of reality in itself, because both of them fundamentally are attributes of a reality which is both first and third person. So in other words, if we want to understand consciousness, what we're really asking is, how is it that first and third person can arise at all? How can we take these different perspectives? Who is it that sees objects or sees their own ability to see, which is what consciousness would be, right? So we can't hope to understand consciousness by reducing it to the third person mechanical description from the outside. I don't think that works, and I'm not sure if that's what you're saying, but I don't know what else you could be saying, so clarify your position on that if I am mischaracterizing it by saying you're trying to reduce the first person to the third person, or the experiential conscious awareness that we have to the neurophysiological state or ongoing process of the brain. But of course, none of this is to say that we shouldn't use empirical evidence, experimental evidence, in order to back up the claims and theories that we devise in order to understand consciousness. We should do experiments, but these experiments are going to involve introspection. They're going to involve exploring our own subjective states, and this isn't something that science has typically allowed into its field of investigation, because you can't measure it with a ruler. You can't keep track of it temporally with a clock. I mean, it's unseen. This evidence that you're trying to get. It's your own experience, and so it kind of requires a bit of expansion, I guess, of what science has typically been about. I think it can handle this expansion without becoming unscientific. We can still have a rigorous account of our own subjective experience, and in fact there are already attempts to do this, whether it's in our own Western tradition coming out of phenomenology, which began with Husserl, beginning of the 20th century, or if it's coming out of Buddhism, which is thousands of years old. We have some kind of foundation from which to draw to begin this scientific study of conscious experience. And I consider this all part of what it means to empirically investigate consciousness. Empiricism may be traditionally meant only through the five senses, which means something that is seen or felt or heard, rather than that which hears or that which sees. So we're extending empiricism, or radicalizing empiricism, as William James referred to it, so that meaning and causality and intuition play a role in what reality is, because those are the features of consciousness. And if we're going to remain empirical in the classic sense, Hume famously pointed out that there is no way to derive causality or to perform any kind of induction based only on your sensory experience. You can't derive causation from these discrete sensory impressions in the world that supposedly form, the beginning of our scientific investigation. If that's all we admit into science, causality and induction are impossible, or at least unjustified. So by radicalizing empiricism, not only do we allow consciousness to become a legitimate area of scientific research, but we ground causality and our ability to use induction to come to certain scientific theories in some kind of actuality. Whereas if sensory impressions is all we have, we're just assuming causality and induction. So you mentioned the blind spot, change blindness, and synesthesia as examples of these certain effects that show us how consciousness is not what we think it is. And it's true, there are these weird kinds of experience that kind of deconstruct our normal, everyday, egoic sense of consciousness. And in fact, our egoic kind of consciousness, our rational waking mind, is probably, we only are awake even for about 16 hours a day. The rest of the day, or night, we're sleeping and unconscious or dreaming. And even during the day, most of the time we're kind of just lost in our surroundings, automatically performing the functions that our bodies have habitually learned to perform without our attention. Only when we directly interact with other people, or reading something, or some task which requires our focused attention, are we actually in this egoic state of consciousness, which is, on average, probably one of the least, or least prominent aspects of our experience throughout the day. So consciousness is not what we think. We both agree on that. I'm running out of time. I want to talk about the middle world bias that you mentioned, but maybe I'll post another video. Thanks for your thoughts.